A year ago, on December 1st, 2015, a version of Rainbow Six Siege released that was almost unrecognizable compared to the game at any other point in time. Its E3 reveal, its public beta versions, and the latest version that I've been playing over the last couple weeks are all very different iterations. The game's claim to fame has been an uphill battle since its inception. Somehow Ubisoft Montreal was able to greenlight a game about high-risk, open-ended gameplay as a spin-off after canceling a single-player game about pressing square to kiss your wife. In 2013, Ubisoft North American president Laurent Detox said Patriots was being remade, that the version shown in 2011 was simply not good enough. Then, after Siege's reveal in 2014, technical artist Oliver Couture said that the new technology was actually what was driving the production of Siege. Quote, "Patriots was old gen." And now finally, in 2016, brand director Alex Remy revealed that Ubisoft Suits thought the competitive multiplayer was more sustainable in the long term compared to single player, and that the 25-person team that started Siege were actually entirely new to the franchise. There were only a couple of leftover developers from Patriots on the team. And so the release of Siege, which clawed its way out of bad circumstances, brought something that has become increasingly rare to us, and that is a moment where a new evolution of graphical technology drives the artistry of game design. A quick glance at Siege doesn't make it look like a breath of fresh air, but playing it and understanding it sure does. It's that cutting-edge, next-gen, I guess now it's current-gen, procedural destruction engine that turns a game of twitch shooting into a game of tactical strategy, where punching your own shapes out of walls is a creative means for player expression that's restrained by a tight budget of resources to do it with. 5 players who can blow only 2 or 3 holes each at best means it's always easy to paint a mental image of what's going on across the whole map, but a quick time to kill, largely dependent on getting first sighting of a tiny sliver of an enemy's pixels, means combat traps players into tunnel vision. Siege strategy is all about finding ways to force players to walk into your sightlines rather than having you walk into theirs. The first side effect of going on a Siege binge is that you'll play any other FPS game like a Metal Gear guard.
Oh, thank! Okay, well, I couldn't look behind me because I needed to face forward because bullets were coming from there.
Yes, you did good.
So stealth and flanking are the universal counters. Intel tools are as abundant as destruction tools. Hidden cameras and drones may not be as bombastically impressive as blowing a whole map up, but the strategies, the synergy, and the sixth sense spatial awareness that it gives players are just as impressive from a whole nother cerebral social perspective. The second side effect of going on a Siege binge is that you'll get way better at talking to people.
Look at this kid. This is ridiculous. I'm so glad I'm recording. Holy shit.
And these dimensions of strategy, depth, and teamwork were what was so appealing to me about Siege from the beginning. They create lasting variety out of the game. Every match is different, every round is different, and that's something that was lost on a lot of other early impressions of the game. Siege did not review well. The Metascore is still underneath an 80, bogged down by complaints about a lack of campaign as well as a lack of modes and maps. But, as I just explained, the sheer variety of gameplay that Siege's tech and design creates turns its 10-map lineup into something that would feel like 30 maps in any other game. A supposed lack of content didn't seem like a downside to me at the time. In fact, it seemed like a downright misconception. So learning and appreciating where Siege's value lies is something that seemed to be better steered towards reviewers whose biases more enjoy games that feel like a breath of fresh air than games that feel like a new version of the well-polished establishment. Stack on top of that some misleading trailers, a high price tag, microtransactions, a multiplayer-only game with 10 maps in one mode that requires you to install Uplay, and Siege was a real test of seeing how bad prejudices could cripple a product. I think on launch it was just myself, PC Gamer, and Daniel Starkey writing for Wired that made the only 3 glowing positive reviews released. People were not kind to this game back then. Just 2 weeks after launch, Ubisoft was desperate enough to give Siege its first free weekend, with Forbes writer Eric Kane saying that this proved Siege should go free to play. As you can probably guess, I disagree. I was having fun on launch. But that was in spite of a sinking feeling left without server browsers or wacky alternate deathmatch modes with more players, plus technical issues with netcode and matchmaking. Over the past year, my doubts about Siege persisting in the long term without a server browser or larger scale modes have fizzled away entirely. That stuff just no longer seems to be what the game's about. But the netcode and matchmaking issues are still there. They were dramatically improved after the first few updates, and while netcode and the hit detection attached to it is unquestionably better than it was at launch, Ubisoft's matchmaking services took a dive at some point after the Operation Skull Rain patch dropped in July. Which is a shame. For a few good months between January and July, Rainbow Six Siege, despite all its inbuilt latency issues and the Uplay infrastructure around it, just worked. Between January and July, the game worked better than ever, with virtually all of my original reviews' complaints corrected, while a steady flow of new content boosted the appeal of game for new players. The pressure to correct Siege's early mistakes may have started with the launch of Siege's ESL Esports League on January 29th. That's when stuff had to get serious. Around that time we got immediate fixes to the netcode and hit detection, and with the Black Ice patch in February came a spectator mode and ranked voting and forced spawn variety for much more interesting higher level play. Since then, for the first half of a ranked match, defenders couldn't successfully defend the same spot twice. You are forced to play a diverse set of operators across a diverse set of strategies. That is neat. But with the boost in Twitch visibility and competitive viability via matches played in the privacy of the competitors' own homes, came incentives for the players to cheat. And the sheer prevalence of cheating in those first few months of Rainbow Six Siege really hamstrung the competitive scene right out of the gate. The game's built to have players use so many intel tools that see through soft walls that players can shoot through that accusations are really easy to make in this game. And up until the switch from Fairfight to BattlEye in August, it was not uncommon to be playing with suspiciously accurate players. Up to the point where the competitive scene was rollicked by a scandal in which a professional Siege player was allegedly hacking in professional matches on stream in front of everyone, and they just let him do it. Without sufficient cheat detection, the ESL League didn't have sufficient evidence against this guy, who did release a few statements defending himself but then quit before the game's anti-cheat improved. In this case, we may never know for sure if those accusations were valid, but it did prompt Ubisoft to change their cheating tolerance policy and switch to an entirely different system. In May, the Operation Dustline patch implemented a 2-strike rule against cheaters. My favorite thing about this patch, though, and that anti-rule change policy didn't actually change that much at the time regarding to cheating, but what I actually think is kind of brilliant about the new operators that they've been revealing in all the patches so far is that they make the older operators more useful. Valkyrie's portable hidden cameras can be countered by IQ, who didn't have nearly as much use in the vanilla game before that update. It's also worth mentioning that Dustline was the update that introduced the headgear and weapon charms marketplaces, catalogs of digital cosmetics whose prices are so high that they cost more in time than they do in XP point fun bucks you earn from gameplay. Playing for free for cosmetics is a bit of a grind, but it is possible, it's reasonable, it exists, but it is tolerable. The season pass that Ubisoft uses to support this ongoing content isn't overwhelming, for people who don't have it, at least. As someone who has never felt the temptation to purchase it, I've never felt left out without it. The most heavily expensive cosmetic items here can be had after about 15 to 20 hours of regular play. Same deal with the DLC operators, it's not hard to grind out those fun bucks you need for them. And the DLC operators aren't overpowered either, nor do they, as of right now at least, feel out of place in the game's overall roster. Meanwhile, cheating becomes more offensive because early June has the Siege team permanently banning cheaters on their first offense. For new players, a $15 starter edition was released to dig away at the ever-present complaint that Siege's price tag is too high. On July 27th, we then got Operation Skull Rain, which released my new favorite operator, Caviar, a dedicated stealth roamer whose interrogation can turn the tide of a match in seconds. We also got a bunch of big quality-of-life improvements. There's a unified FOV and compasses for the cameras now, full-screen weapon previews, and being able to see your team's loadout before you all head out. Most important of all, though, was the switch to the BattlEye anti-cheat middleware. This is the big deal. This pretty much ended the game's prolific cheating problem overnight. But what weirdly happened then is that those strange issues with matchmaking errors in netcode, which were seemingly fixed since January, crept back for a little while. For me and my friends, at least. I don't know how much it had to do with inbuilt engine issues, or the Uplay infrastructure, or just rising player counts though, because summer was also the time when we were seeing headlines pop up about increased player counts and a lot of glowing impressions about this thing being the best gosh darn game ever. In other words, it took about 8 months for a grand reversal of public opinion to happen, but it eventually did. Leading a summer sales spike into winter with the Red Crow patch had the game's player count spike even further, even beyond this year's Call of Duty on PC at least. Which shows the unlikely outcome that I truly didn't expect during my original review, which was for Ubisoft to make good on their promise of fixing up and supporting this game long term. Its design and its post-launch support are both kind of anomalies in Ubisoft's MO. It seems like once the genre of competitive multiplayer was decided on, the Ubisoft bigwigs kind of let the team off the leash for this one. But what's going to be facing it in the future is a mix of problems old and new. Matchmaking errors still happen, and the existence and reliance of Uplay makes setting up games with friends harder than it should be, and appealing to customers who just don't want to install extra stuff on their computer. But what's more interesting to me are changes with the game's pacing and strategy that have happened over time. For one, we have the development of incredibly elaborate spawn cheesing tactics, of basically rushing out to kill people just as they've spawned in before they have any time to react. It's a high-risk move and probably really controversial on both ends of the exchange and within the developer team and the competitive community, because the stakes are so high for everyone on both sides. Whichever player loses to that cheese can handicap the rest of their team for the whole match. And I'm interested to know if the developers consider that a legitimate strategy or not, because it doesn't exactly break the rules of the game so much as it's just never fun to be on the receiving end of it. The latest map features these tunnels and towers that give attackers overhead cover on their way to the house, but the second to latest map release before this one seems almost built for cheesy tactics, with 2 towers on defense overlooking the attackers' routes. This stuff was happening on launch, but now any team that's good will be attempting one of these like every single round. It's getting a little ridiculous. One thing that I now unfortunately have to worry about is the maturity of your average Siege rando. And these guys used to be the best randos of any gaming community, I swear. It was another anomaly. Back in the day, it was weird that playing this game with randoms on the internet who weren't your friend was a generally positive experience. People tended to play the game well and talk and communicate and be polite. It was something that was a real positive during the game's launch, and it might be a lucky accident of the game's design, but also its high price tag. This is something that you also saw happening to CSGO a few years back. The lower they make the price, the more likely you are to find Smurf accounts and cheaters who can afford to throw away that account, as well as just kids these days. I swear they weren't around at launch. But if they keep adding new content to the game and keep putting it on sale for increasingly lower prices over the next year, we may see another problem of feature creep cropping up. 8 new operators are in the pipeline, and the character select screen is already looking pretty busy. Adding a new operator to Siege is kind of like adding a new character in a fighting game. They have to make sure it's not too over or underpowered compared to the rest of the cast, and they also have to make sure that the new abilities fill a hole that the rest of the cast has. And the prospect of messing up that balance is something that the team has come dangerously close to. There are dimensions of usefulness that the whole cast has to balance themselves around with. The new Habanero, for example, blows holes in walls that previously only Thermite could, which would have easily rendered him obsolete if it weren't for their smaller size. The happy result is that Thermite is no longer such a must-have on most attacking rounds. On the other hand, Blackbeard's near-unbreakable rifle shield from earlier rendered him OP as hell and a must-have on the attacker team as well until the Red Crow update has his shield shatter. But striking a delicate balance between all of them and the destructible maps they run around in is what I find so appealing about Siege. I just hit my 300th hour, and despite all its problems, I couldn't be happier with how this game turned out, because it's just so gosh darned elegant. The combination of strategy, depth, and teamwork beautifully flow into a game with seemingly unlimited replayability, where every single player action has direct and visible consequences. Especially now that we have 3-minute-long ranked matches. Even waiting around for a few seconds just to think has consequences. Siege is the only game game around where every single bullet hole can be seen through to the other side, where half of the walls on the map can be blown up and walked through, and where even the single act of glancing in the right direction can win or lose entire matches.
10 seconds.
The room to the little room. It's right here.
Protect the bio container.
Did I ace?
Op 4 eliminated. Friendly mission successful.
Alt. Wait, I'm